Back here with Lawrence Freedman's Strategy of History. This is the section on Ronald Reagan. After his Hollywood career came to an end, Ronald Reagan had made his political name as a right-wing speaker. In 1954, he was hired as official public spokesman for General Electric Corporation, which meant he spoke at GE plants around the country, lauding the virtues of free enterprise and warning of the dangers of big government and communism. Reagan was telegenic, with an easy, affable style that helped him link with people who might otherwise recoil from his politics. Reagan also had an ability to drift in and out of the fictional and non-fictional worlds which he inhabited, which made his claims credible even when they were fanciful. His biographer described a mind occupied by stories, a make-believe world in which heroic deeds had the capacity to transform reality. The make-believe and real worlds coalesced in his mind. He always sounded sincere because he said what he believed, even if it did not correspond with the facts. In any conflict between feelings and fact, feelings won. Quote, he believed in the power of stories sincerely told. When he ran for governor of California in 1966, he followed the traditional route by edging sufficiently to the center to ensure that voters were not put off by his reputation. He avoided replying to attacks that he was right-wing and inexperienced, toned down his speeches, and put together supporting committees which included known moderates. One of his managers later explained that they dealt with the inexperience charge by agreeing that, quote, Reagan was not a professional politician, he was a citizen politician. There we had an automatic defense. He didn't have to have the experience. A citizen's politician's not expected to know all the answers to all of the issues, end quote. It even put his opponent, longtime Governor Pat Brown, on the defensive for being a professional. This became a theme in many American elections thereafter. Reagan's team relied on question and answer sessions to address the charge that he was no more than an actor who knew how to memorize and deliver a good speech. While the campaign managers had not intended to dwell on the unrest of the Berkeley campus, they also noted that it worked in their favor. Once elected as governor, Reagan was seen as a potential conservative candidate for the presidency. His hat was tentatively in the ring in 1968, but his real preparation did not begin until after he had finished his second term as governor in 1974. He used a nationally syndicated column and a radio program to keep himself in the public eye, and also as a means of refining his messages, identifying the words and themes that got the best response from his audiences. By this time, more than twice as many Americans, or 38%, described themselves as conservative rather than liberal, only 15%. This still left a majority describing themselves as middle of the road, or 43%. In 1976, Reagan's bid for the Republican nomination against Ford made sufficient headway to set him up for a successful campaign in 1980. In this, he was helped by Jimmy Carter's doleful presidency as he struggled to cope with the economic and international crises of the late 1970s. Reagan's message began by noting the distinction between the social conservatism associated with the Democratic Party and the economic conservatism opposed to deficit spending and big government associated with the Republican Party. He then insisted that, quote, the old lines that once clearly divided these two kinds of conservatism were disappearing. He envisioned, quote, not simply a melding together of the two branches of American conservatism into a temporary uneasy alliance, but the creation of a new lasting majority. The second strand was to claim that not only could these two traditions be combined, but that this would lead to a bountiful future. In this respect, he offered a traditional politician's promise of more of everything, an America both stronger and wealthier, a sunny optimism in sharp contrast to Carter's melancholy. When he debated Carter as the Republican nominee, Reagan sought to present himself as the mainstream and sealed his bid by asking the pointed question of whether people were better off than they were 4 years earlier. In two areas, Reagan demonstrated the importance of getting messages across that cemented his support among groups that were essential to his new Republican majority. One part of this was his appeal to Southern voters who had to be weaned away from Jimmy Carter, one of their own. While carefully avoiding overt racism, Reagan began his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a town notorious for the murder of 3 civil rights workers in the 1960s. Standing beside a known segregationist, Reagan stressed his belief in states' rights, an evident code for the obstruction of black advances. The second area in which Reagan made a definite appeal for a particular constituency was in his pitch to the religious right. Reagan, who was not known to be a regular churchgoer, concluded his acceptance speech in 1980 with a moment that was apparently spontaneous, although actually carefully prepared. He had been wondering, he said, whether to include some thoughts as an addition to the distributed version of his speech. Can we doubt, he then asked, that only a divine providence placed this land, this island of freedom, here as a refuge for all those people in the world who yearn to breathe freely? Carefully, he turned his presidential campaign into a religious crusade. He asked for a moment of silent prayer and concluded with what became his customary "God bless America." A new religious politics was born. This was in part because of the positive reaction Reagan's ploy elicited among two-thirds of Americans. More importantly, it was because he knew before he stood up that if he could send the right message, he would get the support of an increasingly powerful evangelical bloc. Although Carter was clearly deeply religious and regularly spoke of his faith, in no sense could he be said to be following a particularly religious agenda in his presidency. The landmark January 1973 Supreme Court vote on abortion, Roe v. Wade, galvanized evangelicals and Catholics. The radical claim that the personal was the political was now embraced by conservatives as they looked to politics to reverse what they saw as a deep moral decline, marked by drugs, crime, and sexual permissiveness. Jerry Falwell, Southern Baptist, who with his own television show published a sermon in 1979 entitled "America Can Be Saved." The gravamen was that the secular and the sacred could not be separated. Therefore, men of God needed to be trained to go on to be directors in the largest corporations, who can become the lawyers and the businessmen and those important people in tomorrow's United States. I'm quoting from Falwell. If we are going to turn this country around, we must have God's people mobilized in the right direction, and we must do it quickly, unquote. The aim was to establish a moral majority with an agenda that opposed abortion, supported prayer in school, and favored traditional notions of sexuality and gender. Quote, if all the fundamentalists knew who to vote for and did it together, we could elect anybody, end quote. He formed the moral majority, and if Reagan offered an exciting platform that it could support, he promised 3 to 4 million votes. Another leader of the moral majority, Paul Weyrich, described the organization as, quote, radicals working to overturn the present power structures in this country, end quote. Reagan's speech and the appearance of a proposal for a constitutional amendment to, quote, protect the unborn child, unquote, did the trick for Reagan, and he got the votes.